So, so we already saw that we can create calcium carbonate films using the biomineralization approach, and uh, kind of mimics the films which we see in case of Nacre composite. Now, if you remember Nacre's tablets, these brick mortar structures, if you look at one of these tablets, it's got this waviness. Okay, it's not perfectly flat. It's got this wavy profile, and that's for a reason, a very good reason actually. So we'll get to that. But basically, what we wanted to do is see if we can replicate that waviness as well. Turns out, if we introduce into the same biomineralization system chitosan with some microstructures, in this case, say microstructure containing these kind of wavy profile, and we can create these structures by, so we created them by lithographic approaches. So if you create these kind of chitosan structures and introduce them into this biomineralization solution, you can then grow aragonite films right on top. Basically, a very important observation that the mineralization in this case replicates the underlying topography. So you can sort of provide any template structure that you want, and it will sort of copy that template across successive layers, and it will form these aragonite films. But in this case,
it's very crystalline aragonite.
Yeah.
It's not a
No. This is aragonite.
Yeah, that's a lot of people like that. Instead of getting a chunky, clump of a crystal, now we already have this, which is very close to what the animal is.
And you can see this is the top view. You can see that these hard structures sort of form perfectly like gratings. Okay. In this case also, the scale bar here is 500 nanometers, so about 250 nanometers bumps, and also aragonite. Okay. So now we can create these kind of microscopic structures as well. Now these microstructures, these have different applications, but these ones we sort of got even more ambitious and utilize these structures to create a composite. So once we have a film like that, we can peel off these films containing these aragonite, tablets on top, and then we can stack these tablets and then bond them with another biocompatible, biodegradable molecule, and that's how we can form a Nacre mimetic composite. Okay, so this is the process flow. This is the chitosan topography. As you can see, the film is iridescent because of the structures on top. Then we mineralize, peel off, and then stack multiple layers like that, and then we can create composite.
How big structures can you make?
So yeah, like I showed before, it's not limited. The process of biomineralization is not limited at all. I mean, for example, this plastic was entirely biomineralized.
But that came from the oyster.
Yes.
But I mean, here you peel them off. Say how big can you peel off and then actually flatly combine like that?
Yeah. So in this case, we peeled off I think a 1 centimeter across 5 centimeter film. Yes, of aragonite containing chitosan, of course. So there is a chitosan backing layer, else it will fracture, it will fall apart because these are brittle, right? But we created these kind of geometry because we wanted to do mechanical studies, and for that we have these specific dimensions so that we can perform other tests that I will show later on. But we can create these composites of arbitrary sizes. So it's not limited by size at all. But there is a challenge. I'll discuss about the challenge later. Okay, so the fact that we can create this microstructure also allows us to sort of orient these layers together such that we can interlock them, create that kind of wavy profile you saw earlier. Okay, so these wavy profile in case of Nacre were interlocked. And the reason for that is the tensile strength of nacre. So far, none of these nacre mimetic research has sort of duplicated the tensile strength of nacre. Nobody, not even our work. And the reason is that nacre tablets are so, the sort of aspect ratio of the tablets is so high, and so they are sort of elongated and they are interlocked, that it becomes extremely difficult for the tablets to slide past one another. So in a tensile test, what we are doing is we take the sample and we basically, we try to apply tensile load to the sample. Okay, so we pull the sample apart, and that's what I showed you earlier also when I discussed about the tensile strength of the material. So that's what we do. But in this process, when you are sort of stretching this material, in the microstructural level, what's happening is, in case of a composite, the layers are sliding past one another. Okay, and so if you have layers which are perfectly flat, it becomes easier for the layers to get pulled apart. On the other hand, if you have these kind of interlockings between tablets, it becomes difficult, because you experience that resistance, because the structures are sort of stacked onto one another like a jigsaw, right? And that's what we observed here. We performed a lot of finite element analysis of the structures that we made, and clearly we see the tensile strength of this composite, the interlocked composite, is about 43 megapascals, which is almost twice that of the planar mineral composite, right? A composite with plain minerals.
What's the real nacre?
Nacre is about 70.
What a nacre.
Yeah. Yeah. Nacre is about 70. Yeah, it's incredible. That's why I said the mechanical properties of nacre are have not been duplicated by any work so far. Maybe the stiffness, to some extent, some works have tried to report very high stiffness, but no, not tensile strength. So this, in fact, was the first work where we reported comparatively higher tensile strength in comparison to all the other planar nacre mimetic structures, because of this interlocking. So the goal of this project was basically to understand the role of interlocking in the nacre mimetic composites. Anyway, so that's exactly what we observed in our finite element simulations, that the loads, in case of a planar nacre-based composite, the load basically gets transferred to the soft organic layer, which is why the tensile strength is not so high in comparison to the interlocked composite, where the stress is being transferred across these stiffer mineral layers. Okay, so the other advantage is that, besides improving the tensile strength of chitosan, I showed you, the stiffness of chitosan also improved. So if you see, this is a test to measure the stiffness of chitosan, and it's called a narrow indentation test. And here, what we do is we take a very sharp needle and we poke the surface, and depending on the slope of this curve, we know whether this surface is stiff or not. And you can see chitosan is not very stiff. In comparison, the composite, this one, shows about 10 times higher stiffness in comparison to that of chitosan. So the stiffness is about 20 gigapascals. Again, nacre is very high. Okay, so I think nacre is 3 times that number. Yeah. Well, so another important observation here is, by creating these kind of composites, by incorporating these mineral films, we are also toughening the material. What that means is that we are making this material fracture resistant. Now, fracture resistance is a very important property. Okay, if you take a ceramic plate, for example, it's hard, but if you accidentally drop it, it cracks. So it's brittle. That's the reason we call it brittle, because it's not fracture resistant. So the measure of fracture resistance is basically if a material gives you an indication of cracks, that material we can call that material tough because it gives you some signs of cracking, some minor micro cracks or such, so that you can perform operations. You can replace the material, or you can do some repair work, etc., to kind of still make use of that material. And here we see sort of progressive crack formation. So what that means is that when you try to break this material, it doesn't suddenly break, but we see that the crack sort of propagates across the thickness. And that's also something you see in case of nacre. So if you take nacre, for example, okay, so to demonstrate the point, let's see, if we have a brittle material and we try to crack it, okay, so what happens is the crack suddenly propagates to the section, to the thickness of the material. But in case of nacre, for that matter, the composite I discussed just now, what happens is you have these calcium carbonate stiff tablets sitting in the organic matrix. So when you try to break it, um, the energy of fracture goes across, sort of redirects to the softer organic layers. Okay, and as it gets redirected, it also dissipates through the organic structure within the organic interlayers. Okay, so the crack sort of branches across these interfaces, and this is the indication of a progressive failure, and that's exactly what you see in case of nacre. So even if nacre is a calcium carbonate containing material, it does not fracture like a standalone, the Iceland spar, for example. When we crack it, it suddenly cracks. Okay, if we apply an impact to this material, but not in case of nacre. So when you crack it, it progressively cracks. It doesn't suddenly crack. So it gives you an indication of how the crack sort of propagates to the entire thickness of the material, and the energy that you initially applied to fracture this material gets dissipated across the layers, and prohibits further crack propagation. So that's a very important property of any material, which we also see in case of metals, okay, and not in case of ceramics, not the older ones, at least. Okay, so now where we stand. So now we have this mineralized chitosan-based composite, and we see that in comparison to chitosan, this composite now has a much higher stiffness, and so the stiffness is about 10 times higher than that of chitosan, and the tensile strength is almost twice that of chitosan. Okay, and now, as you can see, if you compare its mechanical properties are comparable to that of mineralized structures, mineralized bone, for example. Okay, so besides that, we of course this material is biocompatible, so we did some additional experiments to see whether this could be a potential material for biomedical applications like making implant for orthopedic implants, and such. So yes, it does not kill the stem cells. Okay, so they proliferate on the surface of the composite, and we also see some indication of stretching, which means that they are proliferating on the surface. Okay, so what I just discussed is just one application of biomineralization, and you can actually find out a lot of resources on nacre mimetic composites. So the one example that I showed is that we did not just only one. There are many materials researchers and scientists working in this field, and they have done exceptional work. Like I said, creating the nacre mimetic composites, uh, trying to replicate the strength, toughness, all these mechanical properties of the materials, And also, of late, many scientists are also using this structure to create, stimuli responsive materials or mechanical materials which respond to stimuli in different ways. They can bend, deform in certain ways based on the change in humidity, and these things. Because you have stiffer and softer entities embedded inside the matrix. So depending on the humidity, you can sort of program deformation into the system. So you can utilize them for various other applications. Okay, so that's about the mechanical, you know, that's a research of interest to mechanical engineers. Now, biomineralization has also been explored to create optical materials. And so the inspiration basically comes from this species, brittle star. Okay, so brittle star has got these tentacles, and for many years, biologists thought that the brittle stars are blind because they couldn't find the eyes of the brittle stars. I don't think even we could find.
Dealing with jellyfish. We have jellyfish in the lab that we work with. They have 8 eyes. At the brain connected, each with a brain. So I have no idea what the eyes are doing all the time.
Interestingly, the brittle star can change color, it can camouflage. So that was the trigger. When it cannot sense photons, how can it respond to it? So definitely there is some photoreceptor somewhere, and they realize that the whole tentacle is actually covered with eyes. These are micro lenses lining up the whole tentacle. All the tentacles are lined up with these tiny eyes, and there is a photoreceptor sitting right under that lens, which is sort of serving the purpose of an eye. Okay, and it's the same it's kind of similar micro lens that's also in your mobile phone cameras, because mobile phone, when they try to make the cameras, sort of miniaturize the cameras, they thought of a different design. So it cannot have that big lens design. Instead, they have this micro lens and a lot of photoreceptors sitting underneath. It's called a CMOS, and it basically takes light from whatever you're taking a picture of. It takes light and channels it through these tiny lenses into the photoreceptor. That's how you take pictures using your phone. And those micro lenses are created by very expensive clean rooms with photolithographic equipment and such. But the brittle star also create these kind of perfect micro lenses with proper, perfect optical design, aperture, everything is right, is absolutely correct. And they do it by biomineralization. So that triggered a lot of interest, and this group, they again use another additive, pretty much like a soap solution. They have this additive. I'm not very familiar with this additive, but basically it does the same process of, like I said, the hydrophobic, hydrophilic kind of interaction. So it creates a micelle. Micelle is like this spherical structure, and within that you can supersaturate calcium ions, and then you can crystallize them across the interface. So you get these kind of floating structures with perfect micro lenses, and turns out you can image through the micro lens. So you see the A is sort of being imaged across all the lenses. So this is a way, the approach of biomineralization could be beneficial for creating micro lenses for all these applications. Okay, and most importantly, this process does not involve any high-end photolithography or any expensive chemicals, any process control, nothing. It just happens at ambient temperature with little precursor. Okay, nothing toxic, not poisonous at all. Okay. So besides that, another application And this is important because amorphous calcium carbonate, ACC, is more reactive in comparison to its crystallized counterpart. So ACC has the highest reactivity, and then you have vaterite, then you have aragonite and calcite. So some pharmaceutical companies nowadays, what they're doing is they are utilizing ACC to create drugs. Okay, and one of the best examples of drugs is calcium supplements. So they create these ACC tablets, which has ACC embedded inside, and there is a company which is actually making and selling these for calcium for cancer remediation, because cancer, the environment where cancer cells proliferate is sort of acidic, so they can incorporate these drugs to change the pH locally in those regions, so that you can sort of decelerate the spread of cancer. But this is more of a research work where they created, ACC with a shell around, a silica shell around it, and they sort of incorporated a drug inside the ACC. And the fact that the silica shell is around this makes it pH responsive, so you can expect that at normal pH nothing will happen, but when it enters the acidic range, the shell around it will decompose and it will sort of release the payload, the ACC particles with the drug loaded. Okay, so it kind of serves as a what they call in pharmaceutical industry excipient. The ACCs are being utilized. Okay, so far we have sort of discussed about the creation of ACCs from ions, but we have not discussed much about the transformation of ACC to crystals. Okay, and there is a lot of anomaly going on there in this process of transformation, and a lot of interesting things happen here. Because if you see, aragonite, in case of nacre, has got these particles that I showed you before. On the other hand, this is Anders' work actually. They have shown that corals have these kind of aragonite fibrils. Okay, and then this is another species, a sea urchin, which is a very famous species in this field of research, because scientists can actually take one of these calcium carbonate, what they call spicules, out, and then they can study this spicule as it crystallizes. So as you can see, when it was very young, it had a very high amount of ACC with water and ACC as well. But as it sort of gradually crystallizes, the water goes away, and then the ACC concentrates, and then finally it ends up as calcite. Same species inside is this teeth that this organism uses to bite onto other calcitic exoskeleton containing organisms, basically to eat them. And it's interesting because this is made of calcium carbonate. Their shells are also made of calcium carbonate. So how come this can penetrate their shell? Because it's the same material. So there shouldn't be any penetration at all. But it happens because it turns out these are harder than the shell of other creatures containing calcium carbonate. Why? We will talk about that. But interesting observation, and again, this is also Anders was involved in this work, where they found that there is magnesium present inside the teeth, and it's sort of distributed, as you can see, magnesium to calcium. So definitely there is a lot of crazy things happening as it transforms from the ACC to crystalline form. So here I'm actually discussing some of the parts which Esther might repeat if she presents next week. So, but so I won't take much time in this portion. Just discuss briefly what could be the application of these things, or how we can resolve those questions, but not go too much into the details of it. So if you remember, ACC particles have these water, right? Bonded water. So if you heat them, we see that the water gradually, sort of the water around it obviously goes away first. And then if you heat them up even higher temperatures, the water that is embedded inside you. And all these things are fine, but nature obviously doesn't have the luxury of this processing. Okay, so what nature does instead is, usually this is the kind of the accepted notion right now, that they undergo the dissolution reprecipitation process, where the ACC particles sort of, they're floating all over in this liquid. So this is an abiotic system, but kind of similar things happen in the biological system. So they come together, they combine and form bigger ACC particles, and at some critical size, these particles sort of diffuse, break apart, and then they release the calcium ions, and finally the crystallization happens. So you can see the particles coming together, forming larger entities, and then they sort of breaking apart, and then gradually forming calcite. And this was done in a very high-end liquid cell PEM setup, basically observing in situ how the transformation happens. Right, now this is fine, but this is something interesting to our current work, because this process of dissolution reprecipitation does something very interesting in the geological scenario. So in geology, you have this massive limestone formations containing calcium carbonate as well, and then you have various other species like these biological shells, which also contain calcium carbonate. And in water, there are these two types of oxygen isotopes present, 16O, 18O. One of them is heavy, and one of them is lighter. I think author might have discussed already all these concepts. Just to repeat, basically what happens: the temperature rises, temperature rises. These being lighter, they go up. Okay, so in seawater, you have an increase in concentration of O18. And when you have a higher proportion of O18 and the dissolution reprecipitation process happen, they incorporate those O18s. So if you later take these fossils and then you analyze their O18 ratios, you can then sort of calculate the temperature at that point in time. And that's what we are sort of trying to do in a broad sense right now. Okay, so besides that, magnesium is also a very important entity in this crystallization process, because seawater contains magnesium. A lot of rocks have magnesium, and we see that magnesium kind of results in the precipitation of aragonite than calcite. So definitely magnesium is playing a role, and the role of magnesium, this tiny little ion, is the most is still ongoing. Okay, because it's extremely difficult to understand what magnesium does, but the accepted theory is that magnesium is sort of a smaller atom in comparison to calcium, right? So what it does is, when you have an excess of magnesium in this in the solution in which biomineralization is happening, magnesium knocks off some of these calcium ions from their place, and it kind of takes their place. So then what happens is, instead of the calcite rhombohedra, you have a change in the shape into a aragonite crystal form. And recently, researchers have also shown that magnesium, what it does is this: while this process is at play, it kind of blocks the kink sites. If you remember previously, I showed you, right, initially when I was talking how the crystals grow. So you see that the ions, they experience least attraction on the surface in comparison to when you have only two sides, okay, in comparison to where you have three sides. So these are called king sides. So magnesium kind of experiences so attractive forces in those locations and binds onto those king sites and blocks those sites, which is why when you have mineralization of magnesium happening, aragonite happening, you either get structures which are high aspect ratio. Okay, you get needles, you get these kind of funny shapes, spicules and such. Another important thing is that magnesium, since being a small atom, when it occupies these lattice positions during the crystallization, it also induces strain across the lattice. Okay, if you remember previously, the intracrystalline additives, they sort of occupied the space between the lattice plane. Here, instead, these tiny atoms, they sit and then they stretch the lattice planes in a way that this is sort of locally, there is some local tension and compression going on across the planes, and that's also another way you can make the crystal stiffer. Okay, and interestingly, that's the way the Gorilla Glass is made.
What glass?
The glass in our mobile phone.
This?
Yeah, the fracture resistant glass.
Well, all the phones are broken.
Yeah, so they take the amorphous glass and bombard ions into it. The ions go and knock off the usual silicon dioxide structure in some places, induces strain, and that sort of makes this the glass impact resistant, fracture resistant. Okay, we see pretty much the same thing happening here. So very interesting is that the process of biomineralization, even if maybe it knows how to recreate these molecules or these additives in very interesting ways to create new materials or to incorporate new properties. Maybe it doesn't, but that's what we see is happening. And when we mimic those in the lab, we also see the same structure property relationships being transferred to artificial materials. Okay, again, some texts, but basically it says what kind of ratios induce the formation of aragonite versus calcite. Okay, so to summarize, as you saw, ACC is the key player in the process of biomineralization, and the process of biomineralization enables us, as well as the biological system, to control the structure and then the properties of the biomineralized materials, right? And biomineralization, we try to engineer biomineralization by using additives. There will be two different types, intra and inter, and they give rise to different properties or different kinds of structures. One can create films, whereas the other can stiffen the material. And again, we saw some various different applications ranging from mechanical materials, load-bearing materials, to materials of interest to optics, electronic industry, biomedical, and such. And there are still some remaining challenges, anomalies. Like I said, in case of magnesium, we still don't understand much of what is happening. A lot of debates. Now we know a lot about how the ions from this phase, the ions the amorphous solids forming and crystallizing. What we don't know much about is what is going on in this phase, what's happening, between the formation of ACC and the inception of these ions. So that's something we are trying to develop some basic understanding by new tools. And well, in summary, the nacre mimetic composite is what you saw, increase in mechanical properties. But we did some studies on its biomedical applications. The mechanical properties, besides the mechanical properties, biocompatibility. But the problem really is the naked mimetic composites that we are making right now. For that matter, many researchers are creating. It's very difficult to really create them with a proper shape. Okay, so this has got a well-defined shape. So you have got these composite structure embedded inside this um, macroscopic shell, and it's got a design. But the current approaches that we have, it's very difficult to really mimic proper design. And if you want to use them for proper, real applications like implants, you've got to be able to impose a design, incorporate these composite structures within a well-defined, pre-designed geometry. So that's a challenge, of course. Scale is another challenge. Although we have created these structures at centimeter scales, but real-time applications require scalability and those things. So those are the things that we and many others are looking at. But like you saw, the biomineralization works at all uh, length scales from nanometers all the way up to meters. And our bones are also the product of biomineralization, except that they don't contain calcium carbonate, they contain hydroxyapatite, calcium phosphate, basically. So, okay, so with that, it's a wrap. And that's the most beautiful structures realized by biomineralization in nature. Yeah. Questions?